It begins, as so many unsettling tales do, with something deceptively simple. A dream. In the autumn of 1871, in a quiet pocket of Georgia, four cousins awoke on separate nights with the same haunting vision clinging to their memories. At first, none of them spoke of it aloud. Dreams were considered private, often meaningless, mere flickers of the mind during sleep. Yet this one lingered, searing itself into their thoughts with a vividness that would not fade. The dream was always the same. Each cousin found themselves standing at the base of a grand staircase, a structure so unlike anything in their modest homes that it seemed borrowed from another world. The banister stretched high, polished smooth like darkened mahogany. A faint oil lamp flickered against the wall, throwing shadows across steps that seemed impossibly wide, impossibly tall. The silence was suffocating, thick as velvet. They could hear only their own footsteps echoing faintly as they began to climb. But before they ever reached the top, the dream always dissolved, pulling them awake with a rush of cold air and pounding hearts. For one child, the memory was accompanied by a sharp fear, a sense that something waited at the landing just beyond their sight. For another, it was strangely magnetic, an urge to reach the door they sensed at the top, even though it never appeared fully in the dream. They described the same details, the curve of the stair, the strange stillness of the house around it, and the way the air seemed heavier the higher they climbed. It was too precise, too consistent to be dismissed as a trick of sleep. What makes the story remarkable is not that one child dreamed of such a staircase, but that all four did. And they dreamed it not once, but many times, over the course of weeks. They were separated by distance, living in different houses across the town and countryside. Yet they shared the same strange journey night after night. None of them could have overheard the other's descriptions, for each kept silent at first, dismissing the vision as their own private secret. Only later, through hesitant confession, would the cousins discover the terrifying truth: they were all being drawn to the same impossible place. In the small hours of morning, when the rest of the household lay still, the children lay awake, staring at ceilings, listening to the wind rattle shutters, wondering if sleep would betray them again. And always it did. Always the staircase returned. Some nights they climbed 2 steps higher than before, their hands grazing the smooth rail as though it were real beneath their fingers. Other nights, the dream began further along, as if picking up where it had left off. This continuity, this persistence, made the vision unbearable. Dreams are supposed to be fleeting. These felt like chapters in an unfinished story. Even now, the strangeness of the detail remained striking. The cousins could describe the lamp, the grain of the banister, the precise number of steps they had ascended before waking. When they later compared their experiences, the descriptions aligned almost perfectly, down to the quality of the shadows and the absence of any sound beyond their footsteps. One claimed to have smelled smoke, faint and acrid, as though a fire had once blackened the walls. Another swore that, in the distance above, a faint hum could be heard, neither music nor speech, but something alive all the same. For those listening today, it may sound like imagination at play, the creative conjurings of restless young minds. Yet in 1871, in a town where superstition mingled freely with faith, such a coincidence did not sit easily. Children were thought to be impressionable, but also closer to the unseen. Dreams were sometimes spoken of as warnings, whispers of the divine, or, more darkly, temptations from the other side. To dream of the same thing as another, without prior conversation, was to brush against the possibility of the supernatural. And there was something else. No one in the family recognized the staircase. Their own homes were modest, their staircases plain and narrow, without grandeur or polish. The cousins had never visited any mansion that resembled it, nor read of one in the books available to them. This staircase belonged nowhere in their world, yet it had lodged itself in their minds with the force of memory. It was as if they were recalling a place that had never existed. As weeks stretched into months, the dreams began to weigh on them. They woke tired, restless, anxious. One child began refusing to sleep at all, keeping a candle burning late into the night. Another insisted she could still feel the banisters chill in her hand hours after waking. Their parents, overhearing snippets of anxious talk, brushed it aside as childish imagination, not yet realizing the depth of the phenomenon. The image of the staircase, glimmering in lamplight, leading into shadows, would never leave them. For the cousins, it became less a dream and more a visitation, a place as real as the ground they walked on. They never reached the top. They never saw what waited beyond the landing. Yet the haunting sameness of their visions carried a weight of dread, as though the dream itself demanded to be taken seriously. This was no ordinary nightmare. It was a shared descent, or perhaps ascent, into something the waking world could not explain. The children could not have known it then, but the staircase would grow to define their lives, binding them together in fear and secrecy. And for those who would later hear of it, the mystery would remain: how could four young minds, untouched by each other's stories, dream of the same impossible staircase that seemed to belong to nowhere at all? To understand the weight of what unfolded, one must first step into the soil of Georgia in 1871, when the dreams began. The cousins belonged to a family stretched across farms and small homesteads in a region scarred by the Civil War. Only 6 years had passed since the final battles. The land itself seemed restless, its fields burned, its mansions broken shells of grandeur, its people caught between mourning and rebuilding. For families like theirs, survival meant adapting to a new world while carrying the burdens of the old. The cousins were tied by blood and by land. Their family had once owned more property, more wealth, but like so many others, they had been stripped down to near nothing after the war. Their plantations had fallen into ruin, their cotton fields barely produced, and whispers of debts followed them in every social gathering. Once a family of stature, they now lived between pride and poverty, clinging to fragments of gentility while their houses decayed around them. The children, innocent of such concerns, nevertheless grew up in an atmosphere heavy with disappointment, shame, and silence about what had been lost. Their homes reflected that decline. The walls bore water stains from leaking roofs. The staircases that did exist in those houses were narrow, functional, without polish or ornament. Nothing about them resembled the staircase of their dreams. Their reality was one of frugality, patchwork quilts, hand-me-down furniture, and porches that creaked in the wind. Yet alongside the decay, there remained a stubborn insistence on maintaining dignity. Family portraits, though faded, still hung in parlors. Sunday clothes were still pressed for church. And at night, families gathered by oil lamps to read scripture, their faith clutched tightly as both anchor and shield. Religion wove itself through every corner of life. The Civil War had not only devastated homes but had shattered certainties. For many in Georgia, God's will was seen in every misfortune and every blessing. Superstition threaded through this faith, too, an older Southern Gothic belief that the past lingered, that spirits clung to ruins, that tragedy imprinted itself upon families for generations. In such a culture, a shared dream could not be dismissed as lightly as it might today. The setting itself breathed an atmosphere where mystery could grow, where imagination and belief were in constant, uneasy conversation. The cousins were not strangers to tragedy. Their parents and grandparents carried memories of lost brothers, husbands, and fathers who had never returned from war. Fields where they played as children still yielded bits of rusted metal, stray bullets, buttons torn from uniforms. In whispers, they heard stories of raids, of barns set ablaze, of neighbors who vanished when the battles came too close. Even if they were too young to fully understand, the children felt that aura of unfinished mourning in the air. It was in the way their elders fell quiet at certain songs, the way some places in town were avoided, the way silence stretched in the evenings as though listening for something long gone. It is in this world of shadows and echoes that the staircase appeared in their dreams. The contrast is stark. In their daily lives, the cousins trudged up plain, unadorned steps, or sometimes none at all. Many homes were one level. Yet in their dreams, they encountered grandeur, a staircase polished and sweeping, bathed in lamplight. It was as though the unconscious mind had reached for something the waking world denied them, conjuring architecture beyond their experience. But if it was mere wishful imagining, why did they all dream it together? And why did the dream feel heavy with dread, not delight? Their family's story adds a layer of unease. This was not a family of strangers to secrets. Old letters hidden in trunks spoke of land disputes, feuds, and debts unpaid. One ancestor had been rumored to dabble in spiritual practices unfit for polite mention. Another was said to have gone mad in his final years, muttering about things seen in the night. In such a lineage, the possibility of something strange, something unspoken, finding its way into the blood of descendants does not seem so far-fetched. Folklore in the South often spoke of curses carried through families, burdens that children inherited unknowingly. The staircase, so vivid and insistent, might have been less a dream and more an inheritance. The town itself played its role. Georgia in the Reconstruction era was a place half turned toward progress, half trapped in decay. New schools were being built, yet superstition still ruled much of life. People longed for rational explanations, but at night they still whispered about omens, about the dead walking among the living, about houses where no one dared sleep. Neighbors watched one another with a mixture of suspicion and familiarity. Secrets rarely remained contained. And when the cousins eventually spoke of their dreams, it would not take long for whispers to escape the family walls and settle into the wider community. But in the beginning, it was just the family. Parents who worked fields with tired hands, mothers who clung to Bibles, children who played in yards shadowed by the ruins of what once had been mansions. Into that weary, bruised world entered a dream that felt both foreign and strangely intimate. For though no one in the family recognized the staircase, its presence seemed tied to them. It was as if the dream belonged to their bloodline alone, as though they were being summoned back into a chapter of their own past that had been erased from memory. The atmosphere of 1871 Georgia, the smell of pine, the sound of cicadas in summer heat, the ruins of burned-out homes along dirt roads, formed the stage upon which the cousins' shared nightmare emerged. Everything about their lives was steeped in memory, in loss, in attempts to hold on to fragments of stability. Perhaps the staircase was born from this, the unconscious embodiment of things hidden and unspoken. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something older than war, older than memory, something that simply chose these children as its witnesses. What can be said with certainty is this: the cousins did not grow up in a place of whimsy or excess. They grew up in a place where dreams could not easily be separated from history, where faith demanded obedience, where superstition was never far from the hearth. To dream of the same staircase was not just unusual. It was dangerous. It threatened to pull the family into a story they had not asked to inherit, a mystery that would soon grow too heavy for silence to contain. The family roots in Georgia were tangled, nourished by both pride and pain. And in those roots, perhaps, lay the first clue to the staircase that waited in their dreams, a staircase that belonged nowhere in their houses, yet everywhere in their blood. It began with a whisper, almost accidental, the kind of quiet remark children make when the weight of silence grows too heavy. One evening, as the fire in the hearth burned low and the shadows on the walls thickened, one of the cousins turned to her sister and confessed what had haunted her in the night. She described the staircase, its gleaming banister, its unnatural silence, the way it seemed to stretch upward into shadows that swallowed everything. Her sister froze, the words catching her breath, because she too had walked those same steps, seen the same lamp flickering against the wall. The air between them shifted. In that moment, the dream became more than just a private fear. It became a shared truth. And with that truth came dread. Within days, the boys of the family echoed the same confession. One admitted to waking in the dark with the staircase still imprinted behind his eyes, so vivid that he felt he could sketch every curve of its polished rail. Another insisted that each time he climbed higher in the dream, the air seemed to grow heavier, as though the house itself were breathing around him. They whispered their stories late at night, voices hushed, as though speaking too loudly might summon the dream again. What unsettled them most was not the staircase itself, but the sameness of it. Each cousin described identical details, the same curve, the same lamp, the same silence pressing in from every side. None added a flourish of imagination, none contradicted the other. Their words lined up as if rehearsed, but they knew no rehearsal had taken place. The dream was too precise, too consistent, to dismiss as coincidence. Yet they did not dare speak of it to their parents, not at first. Children in their world were raised to fear disobedience and silence their strangeness. Dreams were not matters for discussion. They were either idle nonsense or dangerous temptations, depending on who listened. So the cousins held their secret close, confiding only in each other, their bond sealed not by play or laughter but by a staircase that did not exist in waking life. As days became weeks, the whispers grew heavier. They met in corners of the yard, in the stillness of attics, in the dark of barns, comparing the newest fragments of their nights. Some claimed the staircase had felt colder, the air biting against their skin. Others said they had climbed 2 steps farther before waking, hearts pounding as though they had run a race. One swore he heard the faint scrape of movement above, though nothing was ever seen. Fear deepened. They began to wonder, what waited at the top? Why were they all being pulled upward, step by step, yet never allowed to reach the landing? And why them, specifically, when no other children in town spoke of such dreams? The whispers between the cousins began to take on the tone of conspiracy. They made pacts not to tell, not to let the grown-ups know. They feared punishment, or worse, disbelief. In their world, to admit such visions was to risk being thought mad, or worse still, to be accused of inviting sin into the house. Silence, they believed, was their only protection. But silence did not ease their dread. Each night, as they lay in their narrow beds beneath quilts stitched by tired hands, they felt a waiting presence in their sleep. Dreams should shift and change, fading like smoke. This one returned with unwavering persistence, as though it carried intention. It was not imagination. It was a place. And every whisper about it pulled them deeper into its grasp. At times, their conversations took on the air of desperation. One cousin begged the others to stop speaking of it, convinced the words themselves gave the staircase power. Another wanted to map it, to draw it on scraps of paper, to prove it was real. The drawings were crude, but eerily similar, each child sketching the same curve of the rail, the same lamp casting its pallid glow. The drawings became objects of fear, hidden away, torn to pieces, burned in the hearth by trembling hands. Yet even in ashes, the image clung to them. The cousins began to notice changes in themselves. They grew quieter, more watchful. Their play seemed less joyful, as though laughter felt out of place with such a secret pressing on their chests. They startled easily, their eyes darting to shadows at the edge of lamplight. One cousin confessed she no longer wanted to sleep, that she prayed for the sun to never set. Another said he woke each morning with the strange taste of iron in his mouth, though he had bitten his tongue in no dream. The impossible was pressing against their waking lives, creeping from whispers into their very bones. And yet, outwardly, nothing had changed. Their parents carried on with chores, the town bustled with its small routines, the church bells tolled as always. Only the cousins knew that something had shifted in their nights, drawing them together into a secret world they did not ask to enter. For the first time, they questioned whether the dream was merely their own. What if something, or someone, was showing it to them? The thought was too large, too heavy, yet it surfaced again and again in their whispers. Dreams were supposed to belong to the dreamer. This staircase did not belong to them. It belonged to all of them at once, and perhaps to something beyond. It was in those early whispers, fragile and hesitant, that the mystery took root. Before the rumors, before the fear of the elders, before the theories and denials, there were only children, children confessing in hushed voices what they could no longer bear alone. And it is in those whispers that we see the beginning of their descent, for the moment they spoke aloud, the staircase ceased to be only a dream. It became a story. And stories, once told, have a way of taking on lives of their own. The cousins had no way of knowing it, but by whispering of the impossible, they had already opened a door. Secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of slipping into the world. The cousins had promised one another silence, yet silence is fragile. Children, burdened with a fear too heavy for their years, inevitably seek release. And so the first whispers crossed the boundaries of the family. It happened with a slip of the tongue. One cousin, restless after another sleepless night, confided in her schoolteacher. The teacher was a stern woman, known for her discipline, but she listened with unsettling attentiveness as the child described the staircase. Rather than dismissing it outright, she asked questions, small, precise questions that made the child tremble. How many steps? Where was the lamp placed? Did you see anyone at the top? The child stammered through her answers, only realizing later that the teacher's interest had not been maternal concern but something darker, a fascination. The next day, the teacher mentioned it in hushed tones to another adult, who carried the story further. Another cousin let the secret slip to a neighbor boy, who laughed at first, then grew serious when he heard the details. He said he'd once heard his father talk of an old estate, long burned, where a grand staircase had stood untouched amid the ruin. His words planted a seed the cousins could not ignore. Perhaps their dream was not conjured from imagination after all, but was tethered to a place that once existed. The whispers began to gather weight, attaching themselves to scraps of memory and rumor. Families in the town recalled, faintly, a mansion that had burned during the war. Some said it had been destroyed by raiding soldiers, others that it had been consumed by an accidental fire. What everyone agreed upon was that the house had been large, imposing, and filled with sadness. Its ruins had long since been overtaken by vines and silence. Few ventured there, for the land was said to be cursed, haunted by the cries of those who perished within. The cousins heard these fragments like shards of glass. They cut through the fragile denial they had clung to, leaving only raw fear. If such a staircase had once existed, then what were they dreaming of? Memory? Ghost? A place calling them back, step by step. The family tried to contain it. Parents, hearing that their children's dreams had become gossip in town, grew stern. They demanded silence. They scolded, prayed over the children, warned them never to speak of it again. But once a story slips beyond the walls of a household, it is no longer fully owned. It becomes a living thing, shaped by every ear that hears it. The townsfolk, for their part, were divided. Some scoffed, dismissing it as childish imagination inflated by idle tongues. Others leaned closer, eager to believe, weaving the tale into older rumors of haunted plantations and restless spirits. The staircase became more than a dream, it became a piece of folklore in the making. And with folklore comes transformation. One neighbor insisted he remembered seeing a staircase still standing in the ruins of the old estate, untouched by fire, gleaming with an unnatural sheen. Another claimed his grandmother once warned that children should never approach those woods, for the stairs would take them where they ought not go. Each retelling shaped the dream into legend, each rumor feeding the unease that already clung to the cousins. For the children themselves, the effect was suffocating. Their secret, once shared only in whispers, now belonged to others, neighbors, townsfolk, strangers who twisted the story in ways they could not control. The dream staircase had become public property, a curiosity, a warning. They felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very act of others speaking of it gave the dream more power. And each night, as they closed their eyes, they knew they would find themselves there again, climbing steps that belonged to no one and to everyone. The first witnesses beyond the family did more than simply acknowledge the dream. They magnified it. They attached it to real ruins, to real history, to the collective grief of a town that had seen too much fire and too much death. What had begun as a private terror was now a story threaded into the fabric of place. The staircase became less a figment of children's imagination and more a symbol, a reminder of what the town itself had lost and refused to remember. But there was danger in such attention. Attention fed belief, and belief has a way of shaping reality. As the cousins walked through the town, they felt eyes on them, whispers at their backs. Some looked with pity, some with suspicion, and some with quiet fear. The children carried not just their dreams now, but the projections of an entire community. In the stillness of their homes, under the watchful eyes of their parents, they tried to forget, to suppress, to silence the dream. But beyond those walls, the story had already escaped. The staircase had been given a place in local memory, whether it deserved it or not. And with each retelling, the cousins felt the weight of something pressing closer, as if the dream itself grew stronger the more it was spoken of. The first witnesses beyond the family had taken the impossible and made it into folklore. And folklore, once born, does not die easily. It lingers, reshaping itself, attaching to ruins and shadows, waiting for the next dreamer to give it breath again. The cousins, young as they were, sensed this truth with chilling clarity. Their secret was no longer theirs. The staircase now belonged to everyone who whispered of it. And in belonging to everyone, it belonged to no one, except the dream itself. When the whispers of the staircase spread beyond the walls of the household, the elders of the family were swift to act. In their eyes, such talk was dangerous, far more dangerous than the dreams themselves. In a time and place where faith was the cornerstone of survival, anything that hinted at the uncanny was treated not as curiosity, but as temptation, perhaps even sin. The parents gathered the cousins one evening, after a Sunday sermon had left them raw with warnings of eternal punishment. The lamps burned low, their flames flickering against the walls, as the patriarch of the family stood with his Bible open. His voice, rough and commanding, spoke of deceitful visions, of false spirits sent to lead the innocent astray. He warned that to dwell on such things was to invite evil into the home. The children sat still, their hands folded tightly in their laps, the words pressing on them heavier than the dream itself. From that night forward, the subject was forbidden. No cousin was to speak of the staircase again. Any mention of it was met with sharp rebuke. The silence, once chosen by the children in their own fear, was now enforced by authority. What had been secret was now suppressed, and suppression bred shame. Yet silence does not dissolve fear. In fact, it often deepens it. The cousins obeyed outwardly, but inside, the dreams continued. They came night after night, as insistent as ever. Each child climbed the stairs in their sleep, the banister smoothed beneath their hands, the shadows shifting at the top. But now the dream carried a new weight, the knowledge that speaking of it was forbidden. It was no longer only frightening, it was sinful. That sense of sin sharpened their dread. They began to wonder if the staircase was not just a dream, but a test. Perhaps it was sent to them by something unholy, something waiting to claim them if they faltered. Each time they woke breathless, hearts pounding, they whispered prayers beneath their quilts, asking forgiveness for visions they could not control. The ministers of the town only deepened that terror. When word of the children's dreams reached them, they preached against it from the pulpit. In sermons thick with fire and brimstone, they warned that the devil found pathways through imagination, that children must be guarded from trickery. Though no names were spoken, everyone knew what the sermons meant. The cousins, seated in stiff wooden pews beneath the gaze of their neighbors, felt the weight of those words like arrows. Their cheeks burned with shame, though they had done nothing but sleep. Religious fear seeped into every corner of their lives. Mothers recited psalms over their beds. Fathers sprinkled holy water at thresholds. Crosses were hung in rooms where none had been before. It was as if the staircase had followed them into waking life, provoking a defense of faith that turned every shadow into a threat. The cousins began to dread not only the dream itself, but the response of their family and community should the truth emerge. Yet the dream changed. It adapted to the fear. Where once the staircase had been silent, now faint sounds began to echo in the children's sleep. One cousin heard the creak of a door above, though it never opened. Another felt the unmistakable sensation of footsteps ahead of her, light, measured, waiting. And then there was the lamp. Its flicker grew dimmer, its flame unsteady, as if some unseen breath sought to extinguish it. They woke trembling, afraid to confess. For to confess would be to risk punishment. And so the silence held, but the silence poisoned them. The more they suppressed, the more vivid the dreams became. They found themselves waking not only with fear but with physical signs, cold sweats, bruises that had no explanation, fingernail marks pressed into palms from clenched fists. One cousin swore she smelled smoke in her hair upon waking, as though she had truly stood in a house long burned. Another wept uncontrollably one morning, unable to explain why except that she had almost reached the landing, and there had been a door, and something behind it had pressed against the wood. Their elders dismissed these signs. Illness, exhaustion, childish dramatics. To the adults, what mattered was discipline, not explanation. The children must not be allowed to stray into forbidden thought. And so prayers became punishments, silence became commandment. The staircase, once a source of confusion, had become a battlefield of faith. This deep divide, between the lived terror of the children and the rigid certainty of the adults, etched cracks into the family. The cousins clung to each other in secret, bound not only by shared visions but by shared guilt. They were marked, set apart. Their dreams, far from innocent, were now considered dangerous, even damning. And so the staircase grew darker in their minds. It was no longer just a dreamscape of polished wood and shadow. It became a forbidden place, a realm they were warned never to enter, yet one they were forced to return to each night. That tension, the desire to resist, the inability to escape, made every step they climbed heavier. The silence in the dream felt deeper, the air colder, as though faith itself had recoiled from the place and left them utterly alone. The denial of the family, the fear of the church, did not banish the staircase. It made it stronger. For what is more terrifying to a child than a fear no one will hear? What is more corrosive than being told that the very act of speaking the truth is sinful? The cousins, silenced and shamed, carried the burden alone. In the quiet of their rooms, they whispered prayers into pillows, tears soaking into the fabric. But still, the staircase rose in their dreams. Still, the lamp flickered. Still, the shadows waited. The family believed they had suppressed the danger. In reality, they had only deepened it. For when fear is denied, it does not fade. It festers. And in the festering silence of 1871 Georgia, the staircase became more than a dream. It became a haunting tether, a symbol of everything the children could not say. By the spring of 1872, the silence in the house had thickened like dust in corners no broom could reach. The cousins still dreamed of the staircase, still woke with trembling hands and pounding hearts, but something new began to surface. The boundary between sleep and waking life started to blur, and with it came the first undeniable signs that the haunting was no longer confined to dreams. It began quietly, almost innocently. A misplaced toy here, a candle guttering out too soon there. At first, the adults dismissed it. Old houses creaked, fires flickered, children imagined things. But the cousins knew better. They whispered in corners, eyes wide with the terror of recognition. These were not random occurrences. They were echoes of the dream, slipping into daylight like shadows that refused to obey the sun. One morning, Mary, the youngest of the cousins, appeared at breakfast pale and silent. Her nightdress bore smudges of soot at the hem, though no fire had touched her room. When questioned, she said nothing, only pressed her lips together as tears welled in her eyes. The adults scolded her for carelessness, but the cousins exchanged frightened glances. They knew. She had walked the staircase again in her sleep, and this time, it had followed her back. Another cousin, Thomas, woke one night to find himself standing at the foot of the actual staircase in the family home. His candle had burned down to a stub in his hand, wax dripping onto his wrist. He had no memory of rising from bed, no memory of lighting the flame, but there he stood, staring upward. And though the stairs were ordinary wood by day, in that midnight hour they seemed to pulse with the same presence as in the dream. The silence around him was suffocating, pressing against his ears until he could hear his own heartbeat like a drum. When his father found him and struck him awake with a shout, Thomas collapsed, sobbing, unable to explain. Stranger still were the sounds. Footsteps in the hallways when all were asleep. The creak of weight on stair treads when no one climbed them. On several nights, the cousins swore they heard the faint hiss of breath, as though someone waited just beyond the landing above. Yet whenever the lamps were raised, nothing was there. Nothing visible, at least. By midsummer, the family could no longer dismiss what was happening. Furniture shifted in the night, chairs dragged from one side of the room to another. A heavy chest, too weighty for a child to move, was found toppled and broken, its contents strewn across the floor. Doors slammed though no wind blew. Once, in the dead of night, every window in the house rattled violently, as though struck by invisible hands. The elders prayed harder, their voices rising in desperate cadence, but their fear was evident. They insisted the children confess, repent, cleanse themselves of sinful thoughts. Yet the cousins had nothing to confess. They were not inviting the dreams. They were prisoners to them. And now, it seemed, the prison was growing larger. The most chilling moment came in late autumn. Sarah, the eldest cousin, awoke screaming. The family rushed to her room to find her thrashing in her bed, clawing at her throat as if invisible fingers were wrapped around it. Her skin bore deep red marks, welts that could not be explained away as scratches of her own making. She gasped for air, eyes wild, until at last the grip seemed to release. When she stilled, sobbing and shivering, she whispered only one thing: "They don't want us to stop climbing." The words fell heavy in the room, silencing everyone. Not even the patriarch spoke. For a brief, terrible moment, all present knew the truth. Something was happening to these children, something that faith alone could not banish. From that night forward, a watch was kept. Parents took turns staying awake through the dark hours, guarding the hallways, clutching Bibles and crosses. But even under watchful eyes, the manifestations persisted. One cousin awoke with her feet blackened, as though she had walked through soot. Another had splinters embedded in his hands, though he had not touched wood. The youngest cried out in her sleep, whispering of a door at the top of the stairs that groaned as though it longed to open. And then came the smells. Acrid smoke, faint but distinct, curling through the halls when no fire burned. The stench of charred wood and scorched fabric, lingering long after it should have faded. The adults scoured the house for embers, for some rational cause, but none was ever found. It was as though the dream itself had begun to bleed into reality, carrying with it the ruin of some long-lost fire. Fear turned to desperation. The elders summoned ministers, who walked room to room chanting scripture, sprinkling holy water, commanding in the name of God that the spirits depart. But the nights that followed were worse. Lamps shattered without cause. Hymnals were found torn, their pages scattered. Once, during a prayer, the family swore they heard a low, guttural laugh echo from the stairwell, so faint it could have been imagined, but so chilling none dared to deny it. The cousins, once bound by silence, now felt crushed beneath the weight of it. They wanted to scream the truth, that this was not their fault, that they were trapped in something beyond them. But fear of rebuke, fear of punishment, still sealed their lips. They bore the manifestations in secret, sharing only with each other the growing certainty that the staircase was no longer confined to sleep. It had entered their world, step by step. And always, the dream persisted. Each night, they climbed. Each night, the lamp flickered weaker. Each night, the shadows at the top pressed closer, waiting. And in their waking hours, the house itself seemed to lean toward that dream, pulling them inescapably into its grip. The family believed they were fighting a haunting. The cousins knew better. This was not a haunting. It was an invasion. The year turned, and with it, the household's faith began to unravel. Where once the walls echoed with hymns and whispered prayers, now they carried only silence, heavy and brittle, as if every word spoken in hope fell flat before it could rise. The family had clung to belief with white-knuckled desperation, but each new night stole another thread from the tapestry of conviction. At first, the prayers had been long and fervent. The patriarch's voice, once commanding, filled the house with psalms meant to drive away the dark. Mothers knelt with rosaries, fingers trembling as beads slipped through them like sand. Even the children, though exhausted, were forced to join, their knees pressed against the hard wooden floors until they bruised. The air thickened with incense, with the echoes of scripture, with the sharp scent of candles burning down to stubs. But no matter how devoutly the words were spoken, the nights only grew darker. The cousins whispered among themselves that the house was laughing at them. Every verse seemed mocked, every blessing overturned by some unseen force. The more they prayed, the more vicious the nights became. They began to notice a pattern. The evenings when the hymns rang loudest were the ones when the footsteps grew bolder, when the shadows stretched farther. Faith, instead of shielding them, seemed to provoke. Doubt seeped in first through the children. They stopped repeating the words with conviction, mouthing them instead with hollow lips. When questioned, they insisted they were tired. But in truth, they no longer believed the prayers reached anyone who could help. For them, the silence after each prayer was more terrifying than the noise of the haunting. Silence meant abandonment. Silence meant they were alone. The adults resisted longer, but even they could not withstand the mounting dread. One mother broke down when her infant, barely 2 years old, was found screaming in its cradle, tiny hands clawing at unseen shapes above. She sobbed and cursed her own faith, crying that God had turned his face away. The ministers who visited tried to scold her, insisting her doubt was feeding the evil. Yet they, too, left the house pale and shaken, unwilling to stay past sundown. One Sunday morning, the family gathered as always, but when the patriarch opened his Bible, the pages fell loose, unbound, fluttering to the floor as though some hand had sliced the spine apart. Gasps filled the room. No one spoke. They simply stared at the ruined book lying like a carcass across the floorboards. That evening, the prayers ceased. Not by decision, but by paralysis. None could bring themselves to speak, for fear the house would answer. It was in that vacuum of faith that the manifestations grew stronger still. The footsteps on the stairs no longer stopped when lights were lit, they continued boldly, heavy and deliberate, echoing until every heart froze in dread. Whispers slithered through the hallways, too faint to decipher, yet too distinct to dismiss. At times, the cousins claimed they heard their own names spoken in those whispers, stretched and twisted in voices that almost belonged to their parents, but not quite. The most devout among them tried to resist the doubt. Sarah, though shaken by her earlier torment, still clutched her cross tightly, whispering scripture even as she wept. But one night, she woke to find the cross blackened, as though scorched by fire. She screamed, hurling it away, and after that, she never prayed aloud again. The unraveling spread beyond words. Once, the family had clung to ritual, lighting candles, blessing meals, marking the doorways with holy symbols. But now those candles sputtered out seconds after they were lit. The meals spoiled faster than they should, milk turning sour, bread molding overnight. The markings on the doors faded as though scrubbed by invisible hands. Faith was not simply weakening, it was being erased. The children sensed the shift more acutely than anyone. Where once they had hidden behind their parents, believing in their protection, now they saw only fear in their elders' eyes. The roles inverted. It was the children who whispered comfort to one another, who huddled in beds like soldiers in a trench, waiting for a dawn that never brought safety. And then came the worst sign. One by one, the cousins stopped seeing light in their dreams. Where once the staircase had been illuminated by a flickering lamp, however weak, now they climbed in near total darkness. The flame was dying. With each step upward, their terror grew sharper, more suffocating, because they knew what it meant. The flame had been faith itself, faltering, shrinking, unable to withstand the weight of what haunted them. The elders noticed changes, too, though they spoke of them in hushed tones. Some nights, when they woke suddenly, they swore they could see faint shadows kneeling at the family altar, mimicking prayer with bowed heads. But those shadows never moved with human rhythm. They jerked and shuddered, as though mocking the act itself. The sight drove more nails into the coffin of their faith. If even prayer could be corrupted, then what was left to hold on to? As winter pressed upon them, the house fell silent in new, horrifying ways. No prayers, no hymns, no cries of devotion echoed anymore. Only the low groans of the structure settling, the occasional thud of movement upstairs, the faint scratching at doors as though something sought entry. Faith had been the family's armor, however fragile. Now stripped of it, they stood exposed, naked before whatever evil had claimed them. The cousins felt the difference most deeply. They no longer dreamed of merely climbing the staircase. Now, they felt themselves pushed upward by unseen force, as if compelled to reach the top. And though the flame of their lamp had nearly died, the shadows above had grown more solid, more expectant. They waited. They wanted. One night, as the family sat in uneasy silence, the youngest child asked a question that chilled every heart: why doesn't God stop them? No one answered. For the first time, not even the patriarch could muster words. His silence confirmed what they all feared but dared not speak aloud. God had abandoned this house. From that night forward, faith was not simply absent. It was forbidden, unspoken. The house itself seemed to recoil at even the thought of it, punishing those who tried. And so the family surrendered, not to belief, but to despair. The staircase, once a dream, now ruled both their nights and their days. And with faith gone, nothing remained to hold it back. The dreams had always ended the same way. The cousins climbed the narrow staircase, hearts pounding, the flame of the lamp flickering against walls that seemed to breathe. They never reached the top. They always woke in the middle, just before their trembling hands touched the banister of the final landing. For months, that invisible barrier had kept them from seeing what lay above. But now, with faith extinguished and silence ruling the house, that barrier began to weaken. It started with one cousin. He dreamt of climbing farther than ever before. His lamp, though faint, lasted until the very last step. And then, for the first time, he saw them. The shadows. They were not mere tricks of darkness. They were forms, tall and crooked, bent in ways no human body could bend. They did not stand still, they swayed, as though caught in some silent wind. Their faces, if faces they had, were blurred, a smear of absence where eyes and mouths should be. Yet the cousin felt their gaze pierce him, sharper than any blade. He woke screaming, his body drenched in sweat, his voice hoarse from shouting a name he could not remember. The others tried to comfort him, but within days, they too began to dream farther. Each reached the landing in turn, each seeing more of the figures. And each woke changed. Their eyes grew hollow, their laughter disappeared, and their movements took on a strange sluggishness, as though part of them had been left behind on that staircase. The adults noticed. They whispered of curses, of possession, of madness inherited through blood. But none could deny what they themselves began to feel. When they passed by the actual staircase in the waking world, their skin prickled with gooseflesh. The shadows were not bound to dreams alone. The boundary between sleep and waking blurred. The youngest cousin, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, described them best. She called them the waiting ones. She said they never moved from the landing, never descended, never climbed higher. They only waited, arms outstretched, as if beckoning the children upward. When asked what they wanted, the child only whispered, "Us." Nights became unbearable. The cousins dreaded sleep, fighting to stay awake with games, stories, and desperate chatter. But exhaustion always claimed them. And when it did, they found themselves climbing the stairs again, powerless, as though dragged by invisible strings. Their legs carried them even when their hearts screamed to stop. The parents tried to intervene. They moved the children into rooms farthest from the staircase, hoping distance would shield them. It made no difference. The dreams followed. The staircase, it seemed, lived inside their very blood. Soon, the manifestations grew bolder. Shadows began appearing at the edges of their vision in daylight. A cousin reaching for bread swore he saw a crooked arm slide across the kitchen wall. Another claimed he felt fingers brush his hair as he bent to tie his shoe. The line between dream and waking dissolved completely. The patriarch, desperate to regain control, decided to confront the staircase itself. One evening, he lit every candle in the house and stood at the foot of the steps, Bible in hand. His voice shook as he recited scripture, his eyes fixed on the landing above. At first, nothing stirred. The house was silent. But then the candles began to gutter. One by one, their flames snuffed out, until only the candle in his hand remained. And then they appeared. Not as vague smears, not as tricks of the dark, but fully formed silhouettes standing at the top. Their bodies swayed unnaturally, their heads twitching in sharp angles, their arms lifting as though to welcome him. The patriarch froze, his words stuttering into silence. The last candle went out. In the darkness, a sound rose from above, a sound like dozens of voices whispering at once, yet none speaking words he could understand. He dropped the Bible and fled, his courage shattered. He never dared face the staircase again. After that night, the family stopped going near it at all. They avoided the second floor, leaving rooms locked and possessions abandoned. Beds remained unmade, windows unopened, dust thickened where once there had been life. The top of the staircase became a forbidden realm, claimed by whatever waited there. But avoidance did not save them. The dreams continued. Worse, the cousins began waking in strange places, at the base of the stairs, hands gripping the banister, eyes wide with terror. One cousin was found halfway up, asleep on the 5th step, his body trembling as though freezing. They dragged him back, but his lips kept muttering the same phrase, "They called me." The shadows had gained power. No longer confined to waiting, they reached into waking lives, pulling the family closer with each night. And the more the family resisted, the more violent the manifestations became. Doors slammed without wind. Windows shattered though no stone was thrown. At night, scratching grew louder at their bedroom doors, as if claws raked the wood. It was Sarah who broke first. One dawn, after a night of relentless dreams, she staggered to the staircase and began climbing in her sleep. Her mother caught her just as she reached the 7th step. When shaken awake, Sarah screamed, clawing at her own skin as if trying to tear something out of her. Between sobs, she confessed she had heard her father's voice calling from above. But when asked what the voice had said, her face twisted with terror. "He said he's already up there." The family realized with dawning horror that the shadows were not only waiting, they were imitating, mimicking, wearing the voices of loved ones to lure their victims higher. From then on, the cousins begged not to sleep at all. The adults tried to keep watch, taking turns through the night, but exhaustion gnawed at them too. They dozed off in chairs, only to wake with the sound of footsteps on the stairs, footsteps that no one admitted making. The staircase had become more than wood and nails. It was a passage, a hunger, a mouth always open. The shadows at the top no longer seemed distant. They were patient predators, and patience only sharpened their hunger. One night, the youngest cousin uttered words none dared repeat aloud, "They're not waiting anymore. They're coming down." And in the silence that followed, faintly, impossibly, they all heard it, the creak of a single step above, as though weight had pressed down where no one should be. The waiting was over. The creak of that step haunted them. It was not loud, not even sharp, but soft and steady, like the exhale of something ancient. Yet in its quietness, it carried a weight heavier than thunder. The family froze, each person holding their breath, as though silence might erase what they had heard. But deep inside, they all knew the truth. The shadows had begun their descent. For years, the nightmares had been one-directional. The cousins always climbed upward, drawn like moths toward the waiting figures. Now the direction had reversed. Whatever dwelled above had grown restless. It no longer wished to wait. It wanted the family below. That night, no one slept. They gathered in the sitting room, lamps burning low, their faces pale and hollow. The children clung to their parents, eyes wide and sleepless, listening for sounds that did not come. Hours stretched like years, and every tick of the old clock felt like a nail hammered deeper into their sanity. By dawn, their nerves were frayed beyond repair. Yet even daylight brought no peace. The house, once merely oppressive, seemed to pulse with a new life of its own. The air was thick, clinging to their lungs like damp cloth. Shadows no longer waited for dusk, they lingered boldly in corners, even when sunlight touched the walls. The youngest cousin pointed toward one such corner and whispered, "It's watching me." At first, the adults dismissed her, clinging to reason like drowning sailors to driftwood. But then the others began to see it too. A darker blot among the natural dark. A shape that should have dissolved with the rising sun, yet remained, solid, breathing. And worse, when they looked away and looked back again, it had moved closer. The descent was not swift. It was methodical. Each night, another sound joined the first. A second step creaked. Then a third. And with every new sound, the atmosphere inside the house grew heavier, pressing down on them like an unseen hand. By the fifth night, it was undeniable, something was halfway down the staircase. The cousins no longer dreamt of climbing. Their dreams had shifted, inverted. They now dreamt of descending, their bare feet dragging down the steps as though led by invisible chains. In these dreams, they were no longer the ones seeking the figures. Instead, they were being sought. One cousin woke with scratches down her arm, deep and raw, as if gripped by talons. Another woke with dirt under his fingernails, though no one could explain how soil from outside had found its way into their locked rooms. The shadows were reaching across boundaries, claiming pieces of them. The parents argued about leaving the house altogether. But leaving was easier said than done. Each attempt to pack ended in disaster. Suitcases vanished overnight. Car keys slipped from memory, no one recalling where they had placed them. Once, when the family tried to open the front door, they found it swollen shut, the wood so warped it would not budge. The windows, too, refused to open. It was as if the house itself had sealed them in, unwilling to release its prey. The patriarch, once proud and unyielding, began to break. He stopped speaking of faith or scripture. Instead, he stared for hours at the staircase, lips trembling, hands twitching with nervous spasms. He confessed to his wife that he dreamt of kneeling at the feet of the shadows, offering himself willingly. "It will be quicker if I go first," he whispered, though no one dared believe he spoke with his own voice. The children heard whispers too. Not faint murmurs, but clear voices, imitations of people they loved. Sarah heard her mother calling her name, though her mother sat right beside her. Another cousin swore he heard his dead grandmother singing a lullaby from the staircase. The voices grew persuasive, coaxing, promising warmth and release if only they would come closer. By the eighth night, the creaking had reached the penultimate step. The sound of something vast and weighty shifting just beyond their sight line. No one dared look directly at the staircase anymore. To glance even briefly at its shadowed landing was to feel a pull, a tug in the marrow of their bones. The family huddled together in the parlor, praying without conviction. The children wept silently. The adults tried to comfort them with empty assurances, though fear had hollowed out their voices. And then it happened. A hand appeared. It emerged from the dark above the last step, pale and crooked, fingers too long, joints bending in ways bones should never bend. It gripped the banister, its nails scraping against the wood with a sound that pierced the soul. Slowly, deliberately, it began to pull the rest of its form into view. What descended was not human, though it wore the suggestion of a human shape. Limbs elongated, head bowed too low, its body swaying as though boneless. Its face was a blur, an emptiness that shifted like smoke. And yet, though no eyes could be seen, every member of the family felt its gaze upon them. The room erupted in chaos. Some screamed, others fainted, one of the cousins tried to run toward the door only to collapse as though the air itself had struck him down. The entity stepped fully onto the final stair, its presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. The lamps flickered, then died, plunging the house into blackness. What followed was never spoken of clearly. Some claimed they heard the sound of many feet descending behind the first figure, as though the entire host of shadows had chosen to join. Others swore they felt cold hands brush their faces in the dark, or breath against their necks, whispering promises they could not remember afterward. When light finally returned, whether from the rising sun or the mercy of the shadows withdrawing, none could say. The family was not the same. The patriarch sat motionless, eyes glazed, muttering prayers that had no beginning or end. One cousin had lost the ability to speak entirely, her lips moving but no sound escaping. Another would not open his eyes, insisting that if he did, he would see them waiting inches away. The descent had not ended. It had only begun. The staircase, once merely wood and stone, had become a bridge, a path that the shadows could cross at will. The family realized then that there would be no final barrier, no sanctuary. The waiting ones were no longer waiting. They were here. And from that day forward, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house every night. Step by step, closer and closer. Not always from the stairs, but sometimes from the hallway. Sometimes from the bedrooms. Sometimes from directly behind them. The descent was complete. The shadows now lived among them. The house had grown silent. Not the ordinary silence of night, where the world outside continues to hum with the soft rhythm of insects, the rustle of wind through leaves, or the distant bark of a dog. This silence was absolute. Heavy. A suffocating emptiness that pressed against the eardrums until even the smallest breath sounded like a betrayal. The family knew. Every one of them knew. Tonight was different. For weeks, they had endured the gradual descent of the shadows. From whispers to footsteps, from shapes in the corners to the pale hand gripping the banister. They had watched the barrier between dreams and reality collapse until there was no longer a line dividing the two. Their waking hours had become nightmares. Their nights, unbearable trials of fear. But nothing compared to this silence. Silence meant that whatever stalked them no longer needed to creep or lure. It had arrived. It was waiting. The clock on the mantelpiece stopped at midnight. No chime, no tick. Its frozen hands pointed to 12, as though marking the hour with a grim finality. The air shifted. Every lamp in the house dimmed, their glow thinning to faint halos, then extinguished altogether. Candles sputtered and died, leaving only the pale wash of moonlight cutting through the windows. And then came the sound. Not the careful creak of a step this time, nor the dragging whisper of breath. This was deeper. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the walls, the floor, the very marrow of their bones. The family clutched each other tightly, forming a fragile circle in the center of the room. The children buried their faces against their parents, trembling. The adults whispered prayers, though none could recall the words clearly. The hum grew louder. It was not one voice but many, overlapping, weaving together into something too vast to comprehend. It was language and not language, the intonation of a choir that had never been human. The walls of the house quivered as though struck by invisible waves. And then, without warning, the staircase began to glow. A faint phosphorescence bled from the top step, trickling downward like liquid moonlight. But it was not light in any natural sense. It was a radiance that seemed to blind rather than illuminate, twisting shadows into grotesque shapes that writhed along the walls. The cousins stared, unable to look away. One of them whispered, "They're here." The first figure emerged. Unlike the blurred form from the nights before, this one came clearly into view. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs stretching beyond reason. Its skin was the color of ash, its face a void that shifted ceaselessly, as though hundreds of expressions were fighting to surface at once. Behind it, others followed. Dozens of them. Their forms filled the staircase, a tide of shadowed figures descending in perfect silence now, the hum fading into a dreadful calm. The family broke. Panic surged. One cousin screamed and bolted for the door, clawing at the knob, but the wood did not move. Another collapsed, convulsing as though struck by an unseen force. The patriarch dropped to his knees, sobbing, hands raised in surrender. The mother gathered the children close, shielding them though her own body shook uncontrollably. The figures reached the bottom step. Their presence filled the room with cold so intense it burned. Every breath crystallized in the air. The fire in the hearth, long dead, flickered back to life in reverse, flames of black and violet that consumed no wood yet devoured the very light around them. And then, one spoke. Its voice was not sound. It was vibration, entering the mind directly. Each family member heard something different, yet all carried the same message: it is time. The words sank into them like hooks. One cousin, eyes glazed, stood and began walking forward, her arms limp at her sides, as though she were a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Another followed, then another. The children cried out, begging their siblings to stop, but nothing could break the trance. One by one, they approached the figures, disappearing into the shifting blur of shadow. Their screams never came. The parents tried to hold the younger children tighter, but the pull grew stronger. It was not just the figures that commanded. The house itself seemed alive, walls bending inward, floorboards groaning, ceiling pressing lower. The room contracted into a funnel, driving them toward the staircase. The matriarch fought with a desperate strength, dragging her youngest son behind her as she clung to the base of the sofa. Tears streamed down her face as she begged, "Not him. Please, take me instead." But the shadows had no mercy. The boy was ripped from her arms, drawn into the blur of figures. His small cry echoed for a moment, then vanished. The patriarch rose, staggering forward. His eyes shone with a strange serenity. He extended his arms toward the figures, whispering, "I understand now. This was always meant to be." He stepped willingly into the tide and was swallowed whole. Only the mother and two of the younger cousins remained. They clung to one another, backs pressed against the wall, as the figures advanced. The hum returned, rising like a storm, rattling the very foundation of the house. The walls cracked. Dust rained from the ceiling. The floor split open in jagged lines that revealed nothing but endless dark beneath. The mother screamed, a raw sound of defiance, and hurled a candlestick at the advancing figures. It passed through them as though striking smoke. The act changed nothing. They were inevitable. The last thing the survivors saw before the darkness consumed them was the staircase collapsing, not falling apart, but folding into itself, vanishing step by step until there was only an empty void where it had once stood. The figures receded into it, dragging their victims with them, until the house fell silent again. By dawn, the house stood as though untouched. Windows unbroken, doors unlocked, furniture unmoved. But the family was gone. Not a trace remained. No footsteps, no blood, no signs of struggle. Only the faint echo of a hum that seemed to linger in the air, like the memory of something that had never belonged to this world. The house became a hushed legend. Neighbors whispered of its curse, of the family that vanished without explanation. Some swore they saw figures in the windows at night, watching. Others claimed to hear the sound of footsteps on the stairs, though no one lived there anymore. The land was sold, resold, and abandoned. No tenant lasted more than a week. And in the silence of midnight, those who dared walk past swore they could hear it, the sound of creaking steps, moving steadily downward. The descent never ended. It only waited for the next family to arrive. Morning came, but it brought no light to the house. The sun rose like it always did, spilling gold across the neighboring fields, yet the house stood as if it were wrapped in shadow. Its windows reflected nothing. Its walls seemed to swallow the day. For the outside world, life carried on, children hurried to school, carts rumbled down dirt roads, dogs barked lazily at passing strangers. But within that house, silence reigned, and the family that once filled it with life was simply gone. Neighbors were the first to notice. By mid-morning, the children had not appeared for school. By noon, the fields that should have been worked lay untouched. By evening, smoke still did not rise from the chimney, and the lights never flickered to life. Concern turned quickly to fear. The family had been troubled for weeks, whispers of strange happenings escaping through hushed conversations. Everyone knew they had been haunted, though none dared admit it aloud. Still, curiosity pushed them forward. A small group approached the house, voices trembling as they called out the family's names. No answer. They pushed open the unlocked door and stepped inside. The air was bitter cold. The furniture sat neatly in place. The dinner table was set as if waiting for a meal, though the food had long spoiled. The clocks were stopped. The beds were made. There was no sign of departure, no luggage missing, no hurried escape. And yet, there was no one. The entire family had vanished without a single trace. The search began. Men combed through every room, lifting carpets, opening trunks, even crawling through the crawl spaces beneath the floorboards. Women scoured the cupboards, cellars, and attics. Children, too frightened to enter, lingered outside, waiting for news. Nothing. Not a single body. Not even a footprint in the dust. It was as though the family had dissolved into the walls, swallowed whole by the house itself. When word spread to nearby towns, people traveled to see the mystery for themselves. Priests carried holy water, sprinkling every doorway. Officials took careful notes, interviewing neighbors and searching for signs of crime. But no blood was found. No doors were broken. Nothing pointed to murder, and yet nothing suggested a voluntary disappearance. The family had no enemies, no debts, no reason to flee. The official reports offered no explanation. Unresolved disappearance, they wrote. But the locals knew better. They called it the curse. Whispers carried through taverns and market stalls. Some claimed the house had been built on stolen land, sacred ground desecrated by greed. Others insisted the family had invited the curse upon themselves through some sin too dark to name. The most popular tale was that of the staircase, that it was not a staircase at all, but a passage. Not leading upward or downward, but elsewhere. Another realm. A place where no human belonged. The more the stories spread, the darker they grew. Travelers swore they saw figures in the windows, pale hands resting on the glass as though pressing from the inside. At night, villagers heard the sound of footsteps echoing across the wooden stairs, though no one lived there. Some nights, a strange hum drifted on the wind, low and resonant, making the hair on the back of the neck rise. The house was abandoned. No one wanted it. The land was sold cheap, but every tenant who dared move and fled within days. Some left in terror, raving about voices in their sleep. Others refused to speak at all, their faces pale with fear, as if admitting what they had seen would only make it follow them. By the fifth attempt, no one would buy it. The house sat empty, rotting quietly at the edge of the village. Yet the curse lingered. One farmer claimed that every year, on the anniversary of the family's disappearance, the windows lit up at midnight. A faint glow pulsed inside, and the sound of children laughing drifted through the fields, though no children were there. Others said that if you stood at the bottom of the staircase on such nights, you could hear whispers, your own name spoken back to you in voices you recognized but could not place. Some swore they saw their lost loved ones reflected in the shadows, beckoning them to climb the steps. No one who tried ever returned. The legends grew so strong that the house became a warning. Parents told their children not to wander near it. Travelers were warned to pass quickly and never look back. Superstition took root like ivy, twisting itself into every story, every cautionary tale. The curse was no longer about one family. It became something larger, a reminder that some doors should never be opened, some stairs should never be climbed. And yet, humans are drawn to mystery. Years later, scholars and thrill seekers arrived. Paranormal investigators set up equipment in the house, their wires and cameras flashing red in the dark. They came with confidence, dismissing the villagers' stories as folklore. The first night passed quietly. But on the second, one of the researchers vanished. His belongings remained in the corner of the room, his bed untouched. But he was gone. Just like the family before him. His colleagues searched frantically, called the police, even brought dogs to track his scent. The trail led only to the staircase, where it stopped cold. The man was never found. The incident reignited the legend. The house was once again sealed, boards nailed across the doors and windows. But the whispers never ceased. Even now, those who walk past it late at night claim to see faint movements behind the curtains. Some say the curse still hungers, waiting for another family to enter. Waiting for another soul to take. The village aged, generations passed, but the house remained. It became a scar upon the land, weathered but never gone. Children dared each other to touch its front door and run. Lovers carved their names into the rotting wood of the fence, only to regret it when shadows seemed to follow them home. Priests visited every decade, performing rites of cleansing, but nothing ever changed. The curse endured. And the strangest part? The staircase never aged. While the roof sagged and the walls cracked, the steps remained pristine. Untouched by decay, gleaming faintly in moonlight as though freshly built. As though still waiting. The family that vanished that night left no heirs, no graves, no answers. But their story became eternal. A warning carried from lips to ears, from generation to generation. A tale not of ghosts, but of hunger. Not of death, but of disappearance. Something that takes, and takes, and takes again. To this day, no one knows what truly happened on that final night. But one thing is certain, the curse did not end with the family. The house still stands. The staircase still calls. And when the silence of midnight falls heavy, when the hum begins to rise from the walls, when the steps creak though no one climbs them, then you will understand. The curse was never theirs alone. It belongs to anyone who dares to enter.